Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to tonight's tale, The Mystery Behind the Deadly Music Box. Picture St. Mary Mead at dusk, roses climbing cottage walls, and the church clock chiming gently. Draw near the fire, your teacup warm in hand. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? A soft summer dusk settled over St. Mary Mead as the village fete unfolded. Bunting swaying and children's laughter rising above the coconut shies. Among the raffled treasures, a mahogany music box drew admiring glances, its melody strangely haunting. Mrs. Cartwright, the cheerful organist, claimed it with delight. Yet before twilight ended, her laughter ceased forever. Found collapsed beside the tea tent, her lips faintly blue. She left the village hushed in shock. Was it frailty of the heart, or something far darker? From her quiet seat, Miss Marple watched with knitting needles poised, certain that death never visits without reason. Chapter 1. Murmurs beneath the music. The music box's last delicate note seemed to tremble in the evening air, even as a hush fell across the village green. For a moment, no one moved. Only the bunting stirred in the faint breeze, and the scent of trampled grass mingled with that of spilled lemonade. Then came a cry, shrill and unmistakably frightened, from one of the young ladies of the tea tent. Mrs. Cartwright lay motionless upon the ground, her cheerful straw hat tipped awkwardly to one side. At first there was disbelief. Several villagers rushed forward, fanning her face or calling her name, while others stood back, hands pressed to their mouths. The fete, which only minutes before had rung with laughter and gaiety, dissolved into scattered confusion. "She's fainted," declared Mrs. Price, ever practical, though her voice trembled. "Fetch the doctor," cried Mr. Ellis, hurrying away with surprising speed for a man of his years. Yet as more eyes fell upon the church organist's still form, a nervous chill passed through the crowd. Fainting seldom left one's lips tinged with such a peculiar blue. Children were hurried away by anxious mothers, their games abandoned mid-throw. Stalls were left unattended, the coconut shies rolling loose upon the grass. Over the murmur of voices rose the sound of the music box, still perched on the raffle table. Someone had wounded again, and its sweet, lilting tune felt curiously mocking against the grim reality unfolding. Miss Marple, seated a little apart on a wooden chair near the cake stall, did not rush forward as others did. Her knitting needles, resting lightly between her fingers, remained still. She observed instead. Observed the faces bending over the unfortunate woman, the eagerness of some to push forward, the reluctance of others to come near. "Poor soul," murmured Mrs. Weatherby, the grocer's wife, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "So sudden. Why, only last week she was boasting about her roses. Never looked healthier." "Perhaps her heart," suggested another, yet not without the faintest trace of speculation that carried beyond mere concern. Whispers grew, weaving through the crowd with the inevitability of smoke. Whispers of hidden ailments, of curious looks exchanged, of an uneasy feeling about that peculiar music box. The more it played, the more unsettled the villagers seemed, until at last someone silenced it by snapping the lid shut. The doctor arrived in haste, but his examination confirmed what most had already begun to suspect. Mrs. Cartwright was quite gone. The fete, though technically unfinished, could not continue. Bunting sagged sadly, and the laughter that had filled the evening air only an hour before seemed to belong to a different lifetime. It was then, as the villagers drifted into tighter, gossiping knots, that Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed a curious thing. Several people lingered near the raffle table, as if drawn to it. Mr. Hargreaves, the postmaster, ran his fingers distractedly over the polished surface. Young Clara Finch, the seamstress's daughter, stared at the music box as though entranced, and Mrs. Price, though loudly offering comfort to others, kept glancing back at it with furtive unease. The music box itself, darkwood gleaming in the fading light, seemed suddenly less an innocent trinket and more an object of strange power, an object around which the village's chatter now circled, like moths about a lamp. Then came a voice, half-whispered, half-fearful. "I saw someone by the raffle table earlier," said Mr. Ellis's nephew, looking pale. "Just before the drawing. They were fiddling with something." The words dropped like a pebble into still water, sending ripples through every listening ear. The days that followed Mrs. Cartwright's sudden demise were curiously subdued in St. Mary Mead. The fete, once meant to be remembered for its cheerful raffles and games, was now spoken of only in hushed tones, voices lowered as though even the walls of parlors might overhear too much. Yet if sorrow silenced the church bells, it did nothing to still the tongues of the village. Teapots poured more frequently that week than in any month prior. It was in drawing rooms and kitchens, with cups steaming and plates of shortbread at hand, that the true current of the village's life made itself felt. Gossip, half-whispered, half-hungry, each fragment offered like crumbs to sparrows. "Poor Mrs. Cartwright," sighed Mrs. Price to her neighbor as they sat in her neat parlor. "So sudden, and she's so hardy. But you know, my Arthur always said she kept herself too close for all her cheerfulness. Close, perhaps, or secretive." The word was reshaped, repolished, depending on who spoke it. At the post office, Mr. Hargreaves declared he'd noticed strange letters arriving for her in thick envelopes, always marked with foreign stamps. "Never seen her send any back, though," he remarked, tapping his nose. "Odd business, that." At the grocer's counter, Mrs. Weatherby shook her head over her purchases. "Always thought her roses too fine to be the work of her hands. Maybe she had someone tending them, someone she didn't speak of." In the vicarage parlor, the vicar's wife entertained a small gathering of ladies, ostensibly to discuss the next church bazaar, but in truth to sift through memory and conjecture alike. Teacups rattled as Mrs. Price leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "She had debts once, I'm sure of it. I heard she nearly lost her cottage before she married that Cartwright fellow." "Ah," murmured the vicar's wife, her expression polite but knowing. "And yet she managed well enough afterwards." "I dare say, not without help." Through these gatherings, like a steady thread woven through the tapestry, sat Miss Marple. She was present at some, absent from others, yet always her presence was unobtrusive. She listened as she sipped her tea, eyes lowered to the click of her knitting needles, giving little sign that she absorbed each phrase, each glance, each unconscious slip of the tongue. For it is in gossip, Miss Marple often reflected, that human truth slips out more easily than in direct confession. The way Mrs. Price insisted too strongly upon the idea of debts. The way Mr. Hargreaves spoke of letters with more relish than regret. The faint hesitation in Mrs. Weatherby's voice when the subject of roses turned toward companionship. Each detail was stored away, not with malice, but with a quiet, methodical patience. And slowly, a picture formed, not yet clear, but certainly suggestive. The music box, curiously absent from many conversations, was nonetheless a silent presence. Several villagers, Miss Marple noted, avoided the subject entirely, while others mentioned it only with a nervous laugh. One gentleman, a visitor from a nearby town, had even remarked that it played a tune far too mournful for a village fete. The comment had been laughed off, but Miss Marple observed how Clara Finch, the seamstress's daughter, blanched at the sound. On the third afternoon, as teacups clinked in Mrs. Weatherby's parlor. A remark dropped into the chatter with startling ease. Mrs. Price, leaning close over her saucer, said with the air of one delivering a treasure, "You know, she wasn't always Mrs. Cartwright. Not before she came here. Why? No one knew what she was called then." The room fell still, the silence louder than any whisper. Chapter 2. The Tune That Wouldn't Fade. It was on the following Wednesday that the vicar, prompted by both curiosity and a sense of pastoral duty, invited several villagers to the vicarage for a quiet evening of discussion. The ostensible subject was the tragedy at the fete, though in truth everyone longed to see, if only once more, the curious prize that had cast such a shadow, the music box. It rested upon a small mahogany table in the vicar's drawing room, polished to a soft glow by Mrs. Calthorpe, the vicar's wife. The lamps had been lit early, for the sky threatened rain, and their golden light fell upon the box, making the carved roses on its lid appear almost alive. "Such craftsmanship," declared Mr. Hargreaves, bending low to peer at the hinges. "I dare say it is foreign. German, perhaps." Mrs. Price pursed her lips. "Foreign or not, I can't say I care for its tune. There's something too mournful about it." At her words, the vicar wound the small key and released the lid. Once again, the melody spilled forth, sweet at first, almost lullaby-like, but threaded with a minor strain that caught the ear uncomfortably. It seemed to linger in the air, delicate yet oddly insistent, weaving through the drawing-room until even the ticking clock was subdued beneath its rhythm. Clara Finch, seated in the corner, stiffened visibly. Her hands clenched the fabric of her skirt, and she kept her gaze fixed on the carpet as though afraid to look directly at the source of the music. Miss Marple, knitting with her customary serenity, noticed this with a small, inward nod. She did not speak, but her bright blue eyes flicked once from Clara to the box, and then back to her steady rows of stitches. "Why, it's charming," said Mrs. Weatherby, though her tone lacked conviction. She smiled too broadly, as if compensating for her unease. The vicar's wife, on the other hand, leaned closer, her expression softening. "It reminds me of something. Oh, I can't quite place it. A tune from my girlhood, perhaps." Each villager seemed to hear something different in the melody. To one, it was charming; to another, haunting; to Clara Finch, perhaps unbearable; and to Miss Marple, who listened as one might listen to the confessions of human nature, it was not the notes themselves, but the faces around her that mattered. When the tune ended, silence fell, thicker than before. Even the closing of the lid felt weighted, final, as though shutting away more than just a melody. "It should be locked up," muttered Mr. Hargreaves, almost to himself. After all, it belonged to poor Mrs. Cartwright at the end. "That it did," said Mrs. Price firmly, "and I, for one, should prefer not to hear it again." The gathering broke up not long after, villagers stepping out into the damp evening, their farewells hushed, their eyes avoiding the table where the box still sat. Miss Marple lingered, speaking quietly with the vicar's wife about the roses in her garden. Yet all the while, she kept her gaze trained on Clara Finch's retreating figure, shoulders hunched, her face pale against the growing dark. That night, the vicar placed the music box in a cabinet and turned the key in its lock. But by morning, when Mrs. Calthorpe came to dust, the cabinet stood open. The box was gone. The disappearance of the music box had become the talk of St. Mary Mead by the very next morning. But Miss Marple, as was her way, did not rush to join the speculation. Instead, she took her customary stroll through the high street, pausing to admire the dahlias outside the grocer's and to exchange a polite word with Mr. Hargreaves at the post office. Her steps, however, were not without purpose. By afternoon, she found herself at the modest cottage where Mrs. Cartwright's maid, young Alice Green still resided, though she was now without situation. Alice greeted her timidly, surprised perhaps that Miss Marple would call. "I haven't much to offer, ma'am," she said, wringing her hands. "Only some weak tea." "That will do very nicely, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling herself by the window where the late sun slanted across the floorboards. Her knitting rested in her lap, though she did not take it up. Instead, she regarded the girl with her usual kindly attentiveness, a manner that had drawn many confidences before. At first Alice spoke of ordinary things, the shock of her mistress's death, the confusion of having no household to serve. But soon her eyes filled with anxious tears. "I don't like to speak ill of her," Alice whispered, glancing toward the closed door as if fearful someone might overhear. "But Mrs. Cartwright, she wasn't at ease these last weeks." "Not at all." Miss Marple inclined her head, inviting more. "She had letters," Alice continued. "Odd ones, in thick envelopes with foreign stamps. They always upset her. Sometimes she would sit holding them for hours before tearing them up for the fire. She thought I never noticed, but the grate was full of ashes after." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on the girl. "Did you ever happen to see what was written?" "Not whole words," Alice admitted. "Only scraps that the fire didn't take. I kept one, ma'am, though perhaps I oughtn't. It seemed wrong to throw it out when it didn't burn clean." From a small drawer, Alice produced a charred fragment of paper, edges blackened, the ink blurred but legible in places. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read the surviving words. "Cannot forget debt. Return what is owed." "Very wise of you to keep this, Alice," Miss Marple said quietly. "Very wise indeed." The maid's hands twisted together. "She was afraid, ma'am. Afraid of someone from before she came to St. Mary Mead. She told me once that her life here was borrowed, she called it, as if she hadn't truly earned it. And she said if the past ever came knocking, it might demand more than she could pay." Miss Marple looked out of the small window at the roses climbing the garden fence. "People do not change so entirely, my dear," she said softly. "They only conceal what was always there. But the truth has a way of slipping out, rather like your scrap of paper." Alice swallowed, her voice trembling as she added the words that had weighed upon her mind. "Ma'am, Mrs. Cartwright wasn't her real name. She lived under another once. I don't know what it was, but I know it was different. She told me. Only once, when she thought I was half asleep by the fire." Miss Marple folded the fragment neatly, her expression unreadable. "That," she murmured, "is a most interesting thing indeed." Chapter 3. A Suspect in Plain Sight. Section 1. The Village Constable's Theory, 600 words. Constable Henderson was not a cruel man, nor was he particularly clever. He was, however, very sure of himself, which in village matters often served well enough. By the third morning after Mrs. Cartwright's death, he had already formed what he considered a sensible and tidy conclusion. "It's the maid," he declared to the small crowd gathered outside the post office, his mustache twitching with authority. "Plain as day. She had the opportunity, she served the tea, and she's been in a flutter ever since. A guilty conscience, that's what it is." There were nods from those assembled, for the story had a simple appeal. The villagers liked matters to be clear, and a servant accused of wrongdoing was a narrative they could all understand. By evening, the notion had spread from cottage to cottage like wind through dry leaves. Alice Green, once pitted for her sudden dismissal, was now eyed with suspicion at every turn. Miss Marple, who happened to overhear the constable's declaration while purchasing a spool of blue thread, made no comment. She merely raised her brows and paid for her goods. Yet her silence, though mistaken for agreement by many, masked a far more critical mind. Later that day, Henderson arrived at Alice's cottage with an air of grim duty. The poor girl trembled as she opened the door, only to find herself confronted with stern questions and sharp suspicion. "You were the one who poured Mrs. Cartwright's tea?" Henderson demanded. "Yes, sir," Alice whispered, her hands clutching her apron. "And you admit she drank it not long before she collapsed?" "Yes, but—" "That's enough," Henderson cut in, puffing up with the satisfaction of fitting another piece into his puzzle. "It stands to reason the poison was slipped into her cup. Who else had the chance?" Tears streamed down Alice's cheeks. "I'd never harm her. She was good to me, kinder than most. Please, sir, you must believe me." But the constable only shook his head, scribbling into his notebook as though the girl's distress were merely an inconvenience. "We'll have you down at the station until this is sorted. The magistrate will want to hear it for himself." By the time evening bells rang from St. Mary's Tower, word had flown faster than sparrows. The maid had been arrested. Groups of villagers gathered at their gates, whispering with a certain relish. "Well, I always thought there was something sly in her eyes," muttered Mrs. Finch. "And young girls get desperate, don't they?" added Mr. Larkin. "No future, no money, it all makes sense." Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly at her window, knitting needles moving with measured calm. A friend who visited that evening remarked, "Well, Jane, it seems quite settled. The poor woman poisoned for some reason or other, and the culprit already in custody." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "Yes, it does seem rather neat, doesn't it?" she said. "So very neat that one might almost suspect it was meant to appear so." Her companion blinked, uncertain. "Do you mean?" But Miss Marple said no more, turning her gaze toward the garden where twilight shadows lengthened across the roses. In her long experience, the truth rarely wore such simple clothes. And as the village sighed with relief at the thought of a crime neatly solved, Miss Marple knew in her bones that the story of Mrs. Cartwright's death had only just begun. Alice, pale and trembling, was taken into custody that night. Yet Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily on. For though the constable had his answer, she remained unconvinced. It was a curious thing, how visitors to St. Mary Mead rarely passed unnoticed. The appearance of a stranger on the high street was as remarkable to the villagers as a comet across the night sky. Thus, when an elderly gentleman in a well-brushed, though somewhat old-fashioned suit alighted from the afternoon coach, curiosity stirred like hens roused from their roost. He was tall, though a little stooped with age, his walking stick polished to a soft sheen. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but his eyes, sharp, restless, darted to each cottage and shop front with the air of one seeking something or someone long expected. Miss Marple, who happened to be leaving the greengrocer's with a basket of apples, paused as the man inquired of the driver in a low, precise voice, "Would you direct me, sir, to the residence of Mrs. Cartwright?" The driver, scratching his head, shifted uneasily. "Ah, the church organist? Well, I'm afraid she passed only a few days ago." The stranger's reaction was subtle but telling. His lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers tightened around the head of his walking stick. There was no cry of shock, no expression of grief, merely a quiet, inward recoil, as if the news both startled and confirmed some suspicion he had carried with him. He thanked the driver and, with deliberate steps, made his way toward the vicarage. Inside the drawing room, the vicar and his wife received him politely, offering tea and cake, for such courtesies were never neglected in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, having been invited to call that very afternoon, found herself present as well, her knitting needles clicking softly in the background. The gentleman introduced himself simply as Mr. Harcourt, though the name rang no bell among them. His voice was cultured, measured, but carried a faint edge, as though each word were weighed for caution. "I had business of a personal nature with Mrs. Cartwright," he explained, his gaze shifting not to the vicar, but to the small table where the music box, retrieved from the fete, now rested. A great disappointment to hear of her sudden passing. At that moment, the vicar's wife obligingly wound the box to demonstrate its sweet though melancholy tune. The melody filled the room with delicate notes that danced like shadows across the walls. And it was then that Miss Marple, from her quiet seat, noticed the gentleman's hand. His fingers twitched involuntarily at the sound, once, twice, before he stilled them against his knee. It was not the movement of delight or nostalgia, but of unease, even dread. "You recognize the tune, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice as mild as ever. Mr. Harcourt's eyes flickered toward her. For a heartbeat, something sharp passed across his features, then was swiftly replaced by polite indifference. "A common enough air," he replied, too quickly. "One hears such trifles often." But Miss Marple, who had seen more than her share of human evasion, tucked the observation away. The conversation turned, as it inevitably must, to Mrs. Cartwright herself. The vicar, still puzzled by the stranger's interest, ventured to ask, "Might I inquire as to your connection with her, Mr. Harcourt?" The gentleman set down his cup with great care, his expression now grave. "My connection, Reverend, is of a most regrettable sort," he said at last. "For Mrs. Cartwright, though she may have lived among you in seeming respectability, was not without debts. She owed me a considerable one from long ago, and I mean to see it settled, even now." A silence followed, heavy and uncertain. The vicar frowned, his wife's eyes widened, and Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-row. For though the words were polite, the tone behind them carried a chill as unmistakable as a winter draught through a locked door. Mr. Harcourt leaned upon his stick, his gaze fixed not on the departed lady's memory, but on the music box. "Yes," he murmured, almost to himself. "She owed me a debt, and even in death, debts have a way of coming due." Chapter 4. Secrets in the Shadows. It was often said in St. Mary Mead that the vicar's wife knew more of the village's past and present than anyone else. Not through malice, certainly. Mrs. Clement was a kindly, thoughtful woman, but by sheer position and circumstance. People confided in her over-sewing circles, after choir practice, and while lending a sympathetic ear at the church door. Thus, when Miss Marple paid a gentle afternoon call, it was over a table laid with currant buns and a freshly polished teapot that old recollections began to unfold. The vicar's wife, after ensuring the parlor curtains were half drawn against the sun, lowered her voice as though the roses outside might overhear. "My dear Jane," she began with a sigh, "you mustn't repeat this to anyone, of course, but Mrs. Cartwright's life was not always as it appeared. Most here knew her only as a devoted organist, a woman of some means and genteel manners. Yet when she first arrived in the parish, it must be 15 years ago, there were whispers even then." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting resting lightly on her lap, her needles idle for the moment. "Whispers, you say? I had thought she came here simply as a widow." Mrs. Clement hesitated. Yes, that is what she told us. But there were those who said she had once been married, most unhappily. A husband, harsh, controlling, and much older than herself. Some believed she fled him rather than nursed him into his final illness, though no one dared speak it too plainly. One never knows the truth of such things, of course, but her manner at times, so nervous in company, so quick to guard her past, did make one wonder. The clock ticked softly in the silence that followed, each second underscoring the weight of those memories. "And what of her family?" Miss Marple inquired lightly, as though curious only for polite conversation. "None that she mentioned," said Mrs. Clement, shaking her head. "She claimed to be quite alone. Yet I recall once, years ago, a letter arrived bearing a foreign stamp. She grew so flustered when the postman delivered it that she nearly fainted right there at the gate. And after that, she spoke of traveling abroad, though nothing came of it." Miss Marple stored the details carefully, as neat and orderly in her mind as the stitches she so often counted. People revealed far more than they realized when trying to seem discreet. Mrs. Clement poured another cup of tea, her eyes wandering toward the mantelpiece where, among hymnals and family photographs, something half-hidden by a porcelain shepherdess caught Miss Marple's attention. It was a photograph, sepia-toned, its edges frayed with age, slipped between two hymn books as though placed in haste. Mrs. Clement, noticing her guest's glance, flushed a little. "Oh, I shouldn't really," she murmured, but her hand moved of its own accord, retrieving the photograph and setting it upon the table. "I found this while sorting through some of the church jumble. It must have been tucked into one of Mrs. Cartwright's books, for it bears her handwriting on the back. I meant to return it to her, but, well, now it seems rather too late." Miss Marple leaned forward, her sharp eyes taking in the faded image. There was Mrs. Cartwright, recognizably younger, her expression guarded but unmistakable, and beside her stood a man, tall, gaunt, with the same angular jaw and narrow eyes that Miss Marple had only recently observed in Mr. Harcourt, the stranger who had come to the village seeking debts unpaid. The room seemed to still around them, the ticking clock, the faint rustle of roses at the window, the steam curling from the teapot, all faded into quiet anticipation. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the photograph as she murmured, almost to herself, "So, they did know one another, and much earlier than he wished us to believe." There was a certain magic to the gardens of St. Mary Mead as the sun began to sink, casting long shadows across the hedgerows and bathing the roses in a fading golden light. Miss Marple often chose such hours for her little walks, knowing that at dusk people tended to grow careless with their tongues. A lowered voice seemed safe when the birds were beginning their evening chorus, and yet the words often carried further than intended. On this particular evening, she wandered toward the green where the remnants of the fete still lingered, a few scraps of bunting fluttering against the railings, and the tea-tent's poles stacked neatly for return. The air smelt faintly of crushed grass and spilled lemonade, the debris of festivity now threaded with something darker, the knowledge that a life had ended here only days before. As Miss Marple reached the garden behind the vicarage, she slowed, hearing the distinct sound of voices carried on the still air. She drew into the shade of a lilac bush, her step noiseless, and listened. It was Mrs. Price, the shopkeeper's wife, and Mr. Ellison, the churchwarden, a pairing one would not normally expect in confidential conversation. Their tones were sharp, urgent, and rather less careful than usual. "You promised me it would be gone by now," Mrs. Price hissed. "Do you mean to say the thing is still in the vicar's drawing-room?" Ellison muttered something too low to catch. "Then you are a fool," Mrs. Price shot back. "It isn't only a trinket. It was never only that." She knew. Cartwright knew, and now. Her voice trailed into silence, broken only by the restless cooing of a pigeon in the eaves. Miss Marple's ears, sharper than most gave her credit for, caught Ellison's reply. "Keep your voice down. If anyone guesses the box was more than a prize, it will be the ruin of us both." The words sent a ripple of interest through her mind. Not a prize? Then what, pray, had it been meant to conceal? A pause followed, and then hurried footsteps retreated, leaving only the distant toll of the church clock marking the hour. Miss Marple remained still, as one accustomed to patience, before stepping out into the path once more, her face as serene as if she had been admiring the roses all along. She wandered toward the green, her thoughts turning over what she had heard. Human folly was a thing she understood well, and desperation often lent wings to indiscretion. But the idea that the music box might contain, or once have contained, something more tangible than melody was an angle she had suspected, yet not confirmed. Now, however, confirmation seemed to whisper from the very air. Near the raffle stall, still standing forlorn with its painted sign askew, a glint caught her eye. Miss Marple stooped carefully, her gloved fingers brushing aside the grass until they closed around a small scrap of metal. It was jagged, torn at one edge, and far too coarse to belong to the delicate inner workings of the mahogany music box she had examined days before. This fragment had no place among springs and gears designed to play a tune. She held it up, letting the last slanting rays of sun catch its edge. A scrap of something hidden, discarded, or perhaps hastily removed. And if so, removed by whom and why? Miss Marple tucked the fragment into her reticule, her mind alight with new possibilities. The villagers might chatter of poison and jealous maids, but she suspected the truth was wound tighter, as intricate as the tune itself. As she turned for home, the clock struck 9, and Miss Marple thought with quiet certainty. The box was never meant merely to play music. It had carried something else, something worth killing for. Chapter 5. The Melody Turns Dark. It was on a blustery morning, with clouds scudding like restless sheep across the sky, that the truth could no longer be contained. Dr. Haydock, summoned to the vicarage, wore an expression so grave it hushed the assembled company before he had even spoken a word. His spectacles slid down his nose, and he polished them with unusual care before setting them back in place. "I have completed my examinations," he announced, his voice steady but weighted. "Mrs. Cartwright did not die of any weakness of the heart, nor of sudden illness. She was poisoned. The effect was electric." Mrs. Price gasped audibly, clutching at her shawl, while old Mr. Ellison muttered a prayer under his breath. A murmur rippled through the drawing-room like wind rustling dry leaves. Poison, the very word carried with it something insidious, something intimate. It was not the violence of a blow or the accident of fate. It was deliberate, concealed, and cold. Constable Henderson turned red about the ears. "I told you," he blustered. "The maid brewed her tea that evening. It's as plain as day. No one else had the opportunity." But the faces turned toward him did not shine with conviction. Doubt, like a hairline crack in glass, had begun to spread. The villagers, who had so readily seized upon the constable's easy explanation, now shifted uneasily. If it was poison, who might have slipped it in, and why? Could the cheerful maid really have devised so subtle and cruel a scheme? Miss Marple, seated by the window with her ever-present knitting, let the murmurs wash over her. She observed not only what was said, but how it was said, the tightness of Mrs. Price's mouth, the way Mr. Ellison would not quite meet anyone's eye, the nervous tapping of the vicar's foot upon the carpet. It was clear to her that the constable's theory, once so confidently embraced, was crumbling. Villagers feared to look at one another, for poison was a crime of intimacy. It suggested a hand that knew the victim well, that had gained her trust. A maid could be a culprit, certainly, but so too could a neighbor, a fellow chorister, even a friend sharing seed cake at tea. Later that afternoon, the focus of speculation shifted, as speculation always does, from one possibility to another. Some whispered that Mrs. Cartwright had been blackmailed. Others recalled how she had spoken of travel abroad and wondered if she had enemies in distant lands. Through it all, Miss Marple knitted, her mind untangling not yarn but motives, patterns, and the psychology of deceit. If Mrs. Cartwright had indeed been poisoned, the method chosen suggested a careful hand. Poisoners, Miss Marple reflected, were not impulsive creatures. They were planners, observers of detail, relying on patience, secrecy, and the quiet certainty that no one would suspect them until it was too late. And patience was a trait often disguised beneath very ordinary appearances. Evening came, and with it another gathering at the vicarage. The villagers could not keep away, curiosity being as natural to them as breath. The music box, retrieved for examination once more, rested upon the side table. Its polished wood gleamed in the lamplight, innocent in appearance, yet heavy with sinister suggestion. It was Mrs. Price who, reaching out, brushed her fingers against its lid while remarking nervously on its tune. A sudden cry escaped her lips. She jerked her hand back, pale as linen. "What is it?" the vicar exclaimed, rushing forward. "A sting, sharp like a needle," she gasped, clutching her palm. A tiny bead of blood welled up where her skin had met the surface of the box. For a moment the room froze in horrified silence. Then, as though on cue, all eyes turned to the music box, no longer merely an object of curiosity, but a thing of menace. Miss Marple bent closer, her eyes narrowing at the faint glint within the carved lid. "I should say," she murmured softly, "that Mrs. Cartwright's death was no accident. Someone has turned this little box into a weapon." Mrs. Cartwright's cottage sat a little apart from the rest of the village, its ivy-clad walls and neat rose borders giving it an air of tranquil respectability. Yet appearances, Miss Marple well knew, were often no more than a veil. And so, with the vicar's permission and Constable Henderson's reluctant consent, she paid a visit, ostensibly to help sort through the late organist's belongings for the parish sale. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender polish, mingled with something stale beneath, a scent of secrets left too long untended. Each room bore the stamp of a careful housekeeper. Lace antimacassars set squarely upon chairs, hymnals stacked neatly on a side table, china gleaming in the cabinet. But Miss Marple's gaze did not linger on the surface. She sought the unnoticed corners, the drawers that stuck a little too firmly, the rugs worn in places where feet had shuffled nervously. In the sitting room stood a small writing desk, unassuming but sturdy. Its drawers, when opened, yielded little of interest. Ink bottles, half-finished letters, a collection of unpaid bills tied with ribbon. Yet as Miss Marple's fingers traced the polished wood, she noted a faint irregularity, a panel at the back, smoother than it should have been and slightly discolored. She tapped it gently with the end of her knitting needle, listening for the hollow sound. Sure enough, the panel gave way beneath her probing. A secret compartment, cleverly concealed, swung open on a hidden hinge, and within lay not jewels or banknotes, but a bundle of letters bound together with faded string. Miss Marple settled into a nearby chair, spectacles perched upon her nose, and began to read. The handwriting varied, some penned in a neat feminine hand, others scrawled hastily in darker ink. But the tone throughout was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, and tinged with menace. One letter spoke of betrayal. "You know what you did, and it cannot be forgiven. If you do not meet me as agreed, the truth will come out." Another hinted at financial entanglements. "Repayment is overdue, and patience wears thin. Do not think distance shields you." The words grew sharper with each page, blackmail taking shape before her eyes. Mrs. Cartwright, for all her quiet respectability, had lived under a shadow cast by someone who knew her past too well. But it was not the threats alone that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the signature, or rather, the absence of one. Each letter ended without a name, but within the text, a certain name appeared repeatedly, circled as though to mock or to remind. Do not let Harper discover. Harper would not forgive. The name Harper surfaced again and again, linked to betrayal, to debt, to secrets unspoken. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing. Harper, a name not unfamiliar in St. Mary Mead, though few now remembered it belonged to someone still quietly present in their midst. She replaced the letters carefully, her mind ticking like a well-wound clock. For here lay the motive: betrayal, blackmail, fear, and perhaps revenge. But who was Harper to Mrs. Cartwright? And why had the letters been hidden so carefully in a chamber meant to conceal treasures? As Miss Marple closed the secret compartment, the cottage seemed to grow darker, the ticking of the hall clock suddenly louder. Secrets, once uncovered, rarely stayed still for long. They had a way of stirring the air, unsettling everything around them. Folding her shawl more tightly about her shoulders, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "So, Harper, still among us, and with more to lose than any would guess." Chapter 6. Threads Drawn Tight. Suspicion, once sown, spread through St. Mary Mead like ivy creeping over old stone. It found its way into the corners of parlors, the pews of the church, and the benches outside the village shop. No longer was Mrs. Cartwright's death spoken of in hushed tones. Instead, it hung heavily in the air, coloring every glance, every half-finished sentence, every hurried step across the green. Miss Marple, sitting primly with her knitting, seemed merely a frail figure content to let the village drama swirl around her. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she observed, and what she saw, she stored away as carefully as the vicar kept his sermons. At the grocer's, Mrs. Larkin grew sharp-tongued with the butcher's wife, accusing her of having once borrowed money from Mrs. Cartwright. And if that isn't motive enough, she sniffed, then I don't know what is. Her voice rang shrill, but her hands trembled as she clutched her basket. Pride, Miss Marple thought quietly, can make a poor shield for fear. At the post office, young Peter Simmons tried too hard to laugh off a question about where he had been during the fete. Nowhere near that silly raffle table, he insisted, though the flush in his cheeks suggested otherwise. Jealousy, perhaps, or guilt, Miss Marple noted both. Even the vicar, usually steady as oak, showed signs of strain. When asked if he recalled Mrs. Cartwright confiding in him, he stammered. His wife laid a hand upon his arm, her eyes flickering with unease. Their partnership, so often harmonious, betrayed a subtle discord. Fear of exposure, Miss Marple mused, often unsettles the most pious hearts. And then there was the maid, now released but not forgiven. She walked through the lanes with her head high, but whispers trailed after her like smoke. Each murmur, poison, letters, tea, clung to her skirts until her composure cracked in the tilt of her chin. Innocent or guilty, suspicion had already marked her. Through it all, Miss Marple remained quiet, her needles clicking rhythmically, as though the very act of knitting ordered her thoughts. In the shifting play of suspicion, she saw not merely fear, but the masks each villager wore. Pride, jealousy, secrecy, shame, each gesture, each slip of the tongue was a stitch in a larger pattern she was quietly piecing together. That evening, as the last of the September light faded, she walked home along the hedge-lined lane. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the cottages glowed warmly behind their curtains. Yet Miss Marple's mind was not at ease. Threads were drawing tighter, yes, but too many remained untied. Who was Harper? Why the music box? And why did the letters speak of debts that had never been named aloud? Her reverie was broken by the crunch of footsteps behind her. She slowed, her hand tightening on her knitting bag. From the shadows emerged the stranger, the courteous gentleman who had arrived days earlier, asking questions in his careful, guarded way. His hat was pulled low, his coat collar turned up against the chill. "Miss Marple," he said softly, almost politely, "you've been asking far too many questions." His eyes glinted in the lamplight, and his smile carried no warmth. "I'm merely listen," she replied, her voice mild. "And sometimes people speak more than they intend." He stepped closer, lowering his tone. "Some truths are better left buried. For your own sake, leave this matter alone." Mrs. Cartwright's past is claws, and claws, scratch deep. Before she could reply, he tipped his hat and strode into the darkness, leaving the lane unervingly quiet. Miss Marple remained where she was, shawl drawn close, her eyes thoughtful. A warning was as telling as a confession, sometimes more so. Alone beneath the village lamps, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "And so, the mask slips. But whose face lies beneath?" The drawing room at the vicarage had rarely hosted such a curious company. It was neither fate nor fate's aftermath, but something in between, a gathering without clear reason. Invitations had been quietly extended by Miss Marple herself, couched in such gentle tones that none felt able to decline. After all, who could resist a kindly old lady asking, "Do come for a little tea and company. I do so think we might benefit from each other's observations." And so they came, the vicar and his wife, Mrs. Larkin with her ever-watchful eyes, young Peter Simmons trying to appear unconcerned, and even the maid, cheeks pale yet chin-defiant. The stranger, too, arrived, his manner urbane but guarded, as though expecting to be challenged. Miss Marple sat at the center of it all, her knitting in her lap, a smile as mild as the cream she had set out for the scones. Yet her eyes, bright and unblinking, moved from face to face with the precision of a hawk circling its prey. The music box, recently recovered from its mysterious disappearance, sat upon the mantelpiece. Its mahogany gleamed under the lamplight, delicate carvings throwing small shadows against the wallpaper. To most, it seemed harmless, a trinket no more. But Miss Marple knew better. In villages, she had often remarked, the most dangerous objects were rarely guns or knives, but those that seemed almost too ordinary to warrant suspicion. At just the right moment, when cups had been poured, when small talk began to trail into uneasy silence, Miss Marple rose and turned to the stranger. "Perhaps," she said sweetly, "someone might oblige us by playing the music box again. It is such a charming little tune, don't you think? And I dare say we are all curious to hear it once more." The suggestion floated into the air, innocent as lace. Yet at once a ripple passed through the company. The vicar shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Larkin clasped her teacup tighter. Young Peter colored, though whether from nerves or guilt was hard to tell. The stranger, after a pause, inclined his head. "If it pleases you, madam." His tone was courteous, but his hand lingered oddly before touching the box. When the lid was opened, the first notes unfurled into the room. Soft, chiming, haunting. The melody rose and fell, sweet at first, then faintly sinister as though carrying secrets of its own. Every eye was on the box, and then on each other. Miss Marple, however, did not watch the object. She watched the faces. Mrs. Larkin pursed her lips, her gaze fixed on the carpet. The vicar's wife wrung her hands together, her forehead creased with something beyond unease. Peter swallowed hard, darting glances at the others, eager to measure their reactions. But it was the maid who sat unervingly still, her jaw tight, as though steeling herself against invisible chains of memory. And the stranger, his calm expression faltered, ever so slightly, at a particular turn of the melody. His fingers twitched, and a flicker of something, fear, recognition, passed across his eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath. The tune played on, delicate as falling rain, but the air was heavy, charged. Even the fire in the grate snapped sharply, as though echoing the tension. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, then stilled. She had seen what she needed. Not in all of them. Oh no, but in one. A mask, so carefully constructed, had slipped at last. And the terror it revealed was not the reaction of innocence, but of one who had heard, in those notes, a past long-buried claw its way back to the surface. As the final chime faded into silence, a hush lingered, uneasy, unspoken. The trap, laid with nothing more than tea, scones, and a lilting melody, had caught its prey. One villager's teacup shattered to the floor, their hand trembling violently, eyes wide with unmistakable terror at the music box's tune. Chapter 7. The Final Note. Section 1. The Drawing Room Reveal, 600 words. It was the sort of evening when the air itself seemed expectant. Lamps glowed in the vicarage drawing room, their gentle light falling over the assembled villagers. Cups stood untouched upon their saucers. Cakes lay half-sliced upon plates, forgotten. What had begun as a social gathering had become something else entirely. A tribunal of truth, summoned not by authority, but by the quiet persistence of an elderly lady with knitting in her lap. Miss Marple sat very still, her needles resting, her face serene. Yet her eyes, sharp as any detective's, moved steadily from one villager to the next. At last she spoke, her tone kind, almost apologetic, as though she were explaining something simple to children. You see, my dears, poor Mrs. Cartwright did not die by chance. The doctor confirmed what I suspected, that her collapse was the result of poison, a very particular sort, one that could be easily hidden in tea or even within a small mechanism. There was a stir at that, a murmur of unease, but Miss Marple raised a calming hand. The music box, she continued gently, was no mere trinket. Its tune was charming, yes, but within its workings a clever contrivance had been added, something to deliver a deadly dose at just the right moment. It was not a matter of raffle day luck, but design. Someone meant for Mrs. Cartwright to win it. Eyes widened around the room. The vicar gave a low exclamation. Mrs. Larkin pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Young Peter leaned forward, pale. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Now, Mrs. Cartwright herself was not the simple organist we all knew. Long ago, she was another woman entirely, a wife in an unhappy marriage, fleeing in fear. She took a new name, built a new life, and believed her past left behind. But, alas, the past has a way of finding us. A ripple ran through the company, and all eyes turned to the stranger, who shifted in his chair. His face, calm before, was lined now with strain. She was blackmailed, Miss Marple said softly. The letters she burned spoke of debts and betrayal, of a truth that could not remain hidden forever. And one person here knew that truth, knew her identity, and used it against her. The stranger gave a sharp breath. She owed me everything. His voice trembled with passion, the veneer of civility cracking. She left behind ruin, shame. She thought she could escape without payment. But Miss Marple's knitting clicked once more, slow and steady. No, sir. She did not owe you her life. And it was you who tampered with the raffle table, ensuring she would claim the music box. You who planted the poison within its mechanism. You who trembled when its melody played, for it carried not only music, but memory. a memory of guilt. Gasps broke out across the room. Mrs. Larkin dropped her handkerchief. The maid gave a startled cry. The stranger rose suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. His eyes were wide, wild with denial. "No, this is nothing but conjecture, lies spun by an old woman's fancy." But Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost tender. "I fear not, for the letters found in Mrs. Cartwright's secret compartment bear your name, and the mechanism fragment discovered near the raffle stall, why, it fits precisely into the device you so carefully constructed." The room was hushed, the weight of her words heavy as stone. The accused man's face blanched. He stammered, denying it still, but the undeniable evidence lay before them. The villagers watched in breathless silence. The truth revealed at last, yet the final reckoning had not yet come. The room held its breath as the accused man's denials grew weaker, like a candle guttering in the draught. His eyes darted from face to face, seeking sympathy, perhaps an ally, but found only pale shock and stiff disapproval. At last, the constable, who had stood awkwardly in the corner until now, stepped forward. His voice was low, almost regretful. "I think it best you come with me, sir." There was no struggle. Pride had carried the stranger far, but it had also betrayed him. He bowed his head, muttering half-formed protests that even he no longer seemed to believe. The constable laid a hand upon his shoulder, guiding him toward the door. Their footsteps echoed down the passage, fading into the night beyond. For a moment, silence reigned. Only the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel seemed to mark the passing of time. The villagers shifted uneasily in their chairs, each face a mixture of relief and lingering horror. Mrs. Larkin dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether from grief or the sheer drama of it all, no one could say. Young Peter looked as though he would never hear music again without a shiver. The music box still sat upon the mantelpiece, its polished mahogany shining in the lamplight. But its charm had vanished. Where once there had been admiration, now there was fear. The vicar's wife rose quietly, walked to the mantel, and with a steady hand closed the lid. The faint echo of its last note hung in the air, unfinished, as though reluctant to depart. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting folded neatly in her lap, watched with a thoughtful expression. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was as calm as ever. "It is curious, is it not, how pride can twist a man's heart? Pride, and the desire to control what should have been left in the past. Poor Mrs. Cartwright wished only to live in peace. But secrets," she added softly, "are rarely content to remain hidden. They rattle their cages, waiting for the moment to be free." The vicar sighed heavily, shaking his head. "A dreadful business, Miss Marple. A dreadful business indeed. And all for what? Revenge? A debt long past." She gave a small smile, tinged with melancholy. "For very little, in truth. Yet for some, very little is enough." Around the room, the villagers began to stir. Teacups were lifted again, though hands still trembled. Chairs scraped as people made their polite farewells, voices hushed, as though fearful of disturbing the fragile calm. They would go home, sit beside their own fires, and whisper the tale again and again. And by morning, though life would go on, gardens tended, loaves baked, children sent to school, the shadow of the music box would linger in every corner of the village. Miss Marple remained seated long after the others had departed. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the summer night was still, the air fragrant with roses. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes resting once more on the closed music box. Its carved surface seemed innocent enough, yet she knew better. Human hands had turned it into an instrument of malice, its melody forever tainted by what it had carried. With a sigh, she reached for her knitting again, her needles clicking gently in the silence. "I wonder," she murmured to herself, "if any tune can ever be entirely innocent, or if every melody hides, somewhere within its notes, a shadow." The question lingered in the empty room, a quiet coda to the deadly symphony that had played out beneath the village fate's bunting. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the music box one final time, her soft words hanging in the air. Perhaps every tune carries its own secrets. Chapter 8. Peace returns to St. Mary Mead. In the weeks that followed, the village of St. Mary Mead found its rhythm again. Life, as it always does, slipped back into familiar grooves. Roses blooming thickly against whitewashed cottage walls, the postman whistling as he made his rounds, and the church bells marking out the hours with their steady, comforting chime. The terrible business of the fete had begun to settle into memory, though none could pass the village green without a faint shiver of recollection. Afternoon teas were once more occasions of chatter and comfort. Mrs. Larkin returned to her habitual rounds, pouring with her usual air of authority, though her voice dropped to a reverent hush whenever she spoke of Mrs. Cartwright. The vicar's wife busied herself with her garden, clipping roses with a vigor that suggested she wished to prune away more than thorns. Young Peter, though still inclined to glance over his shoulder when a tune was played, began to smile again, coaxed by his mother's gentle reassurances and the steady hum of village life. The music box itself had been locked away. Under Constable's care, its sweet yet sinister notes silenced. Few wished to see again. To most, it was a reminder that danger can sometimes arrive in the most charming of forms. Yet to Miss Marple, seated serenely by her window with her knitting, it was more than a trinket. It was a lesson, a reminder of the strange, hidden currents that move beneath the still surface of human lives. One golden afternoon, with the scent of honeysuckle drifting through open doors, Miss Marple found herself at tea once more, in the company of the vicar's wife. They sipped quietly, the conversation lingering not on death but on parish matters, on the upcoming harvest festival, and the small details that made up village life. It seemed, for a time, as though peace had truly been restored. And yet, shadows have a way of slipping in with the sunlight. The vicar's wife, with a sigh, mentioned that while sorting through Mrs. Cartwright's belongings for the charity jumble, she had come across a small notebook, its cover plain, its pages filled with careful, almost trembling handwriting. She hesitated before passing it across the table. Miss Marple received it with gentle hands. She opened the first page and read the words written there. "I can no longer keep silent. The truth must be spoken. Tonight, after the fete, I shall tell them everything." For a long moment, neither lady spoke. The weight of those words pressed upon them both. Mrs. Cartwright had meant to unburden herself, to bring her secret into the open, perhaps even to seek forgiveness. But fate, or rather, the hand of another, had intervened before she could. Miss Marple closed the notebook softly, her expression thoughtful. There was sorrow in her eyes, but no surprise. Human nature, she knew well, seldom allowed such confessions to arrive easily. Secrets clung fast, and when loosed, they often brought more trouble than peace. Still, there was comfort in the thought that Mrs. Cartwright had wished, at least, to make her truth known. Outside, children's laughter carried across the green, bright and untroubled. The roses nodded in the breeze, their blossoms vivid against the summer sky. Life had moved forward, as it always did, but beneath the gentle hum of village calm, the faint echo of the music box remained, a reminder of how swiftly joy could turn to sorrow, and how even the most delicate tune could conceal the weight of a lifetime. Miss Marple slipped the notebook into her knitting bag, her eyes distant as she murmured. She would have spoken at last, had not someone silenced her first. The evening had drawn in, laying a veil of lavender gray over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. From her cottage window, Miss Marple could see the lamplighter making his steady way down the lane, pausing at each post with a practiced hand. The glow followed him, one small flame after another, until the village lay sprinkled with gentle light, like stars captured and placed upon earth. Miss Marple sat in her familiar chair by the hearth, her knitting needles resting idle for once. The small notebook, Mrs. Cartwright's final testimony, lay on the side table beside her. She had read every word, each line written with a hesitancy that betrayed the burden of long-held secrets. It was not the story of a villain, but of a frightened woman trying, too late, to put her past to rest. She reflected, as she often did, on the peculiar fragility of human nature. It seemed to her that people were not wicked in essence, but rather pulled and twisted by emotions. Envy, pride, fear, and sometimes even love, that could, when left unchecked, harden into something destructive. Mrs. Cartwright had once been a woman desperate for escape. Her killer, a man too proud to forgive, too embittered to release the past. And all of it, she thought with a sigh, could have been so different had there been honesty, patience, and just a little more kindness. The music box, now locked away forever, had been nothing more than an object, a vessel for sound, a carving of mahogany. Yet it had also been a stage upon which envy and revenge played their deadly part. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, hearing its tune in her mind, sweet and chiming, yet forever altered. She wondered if those who survived the affair would ever listen to music quite the same way again. And yet, for all the darkness, there had also been light. She thought of the vicar's wife, who had shown compassion in the face of scandal, of young Peter, who, though fearful, had learned something of courage, of the maid, once accused, who now walked through the village with her head a little higher, grateful for her freedom. Even in tragedy, threads of decency and community had bound the village together. That, Miss Marple mused, was what saved them all, the small acts of goodness that softened life's cruelties. The fire in the grate flickered warmly, its glow dancing across her gentle features. She reached once more for her knitting, letting the familiar click of the needles accompany her thoughts. It was her way of ordering the world, of bringing pattern from confusion, and it soothed her now, as it always had. Beyond her window, the great elm trees whispered in the evening breeze, and then, clear and resonant, the church bells began to toll. Each note rolled across the rooftops, solemn yet steady, calling the hour with unyielding grace. Miss Marple listened, her hands pausing mid-stitch. The sound carried a curious echo, reminding her faintly of the music box's melody. But where that tune had brought unease, the bells spoke of something else: continuity, faith, the endurance of village life. They reminded her that, despite the darkness that sometimes crept in, the rhythms of the community remained unbroken. Still, when the final note lingered in the summer air, fading into silence, Miss Marple's thoughtful eyes narrowed ever so slightly. For though the village would return to its roses, its fates, and its teacups, she knew too well that human hearts are full of songs, not all of them innocent. The last toll of the church bell hung in the air, long and resonant, like the dying chime of the music box, leaving Miss Marple to wonder, was any melody ever truly without shadows? And so, dear friends, We close the cover on the mystery behind the deadly music box. Peace has returned to St. Mary Mead, though faint echoes of the tragedy remain. As Miss Marple herself often reflects, the human heart is a curious instrument, capable of kindness and cruelty, of loyalty and betrayal, sometimes all at once. Now the roses once more climb over cottage walls, teacups clink in steady rhythm, and life in the village resumes its gentle pace. Yet, should you one day hear the fragile chime of the music box, perhaps you'll pause to listen more closely, wondering what secrets might be hidden between its notes. And what about you? If you had stood at the fete that afternoon, what part might you have played? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, may your tea be warm, your evenings cozy, and your mysteries ever intriguing.